Walking into the boardroom of Meridian Technologies, I savored the exquisite irony of the moment. The man who'd spent years introducing me as just his secretary to clients and friends was about to discover my name prominently displayed on the ID company letterhead right next to my new title, Chief Executive Officer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you! The sleek glass doors of Meridian Technologies headquarters parted silently as I stepped into the building I now led. 6 months had transformed me from Sophia James, the supposedly just a secretary who toiled behind the scenes, into Sophia James, CEO of one of the fastest-growing software security firms in the country. Most employees knew me only through company-wide emails or occasional town halls, a strategic choice that had served me perfectly for this moment. I checked my watch. 9:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, Richard Harrington, my former boss and the man who had systematically undermined my contributions for 5 years, would arrive for what he believed was a routine meeting with Meridian's new executive team. The same man who had casually introduced me as his secretary at countless industry events, despite my actual position as head of product development, was about to learn that the company he'd founded now answered to me. The marble floors gleamed under the morning light as I made my way toward the executive boardroom. My heels clicked confidently with each step, a rhythm that matched the steady certainty I felt. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about finally occupying the space I had earned through years of innovation and insight that Richard had claimed as his own. "Morning, Ms. James," called the receptionist with a warm smile. "The team is already assembled in the Oasis room, and Mr. Harrington's assistant called to confirm he's on his way." "Thank you, Devin," I replied. "Could you make sure the new letterhead samples are on the table? The ones that arrived yesterday?" Devin nodded knowingly. He was one of the few who understood the full significance of today's meeting. "Already done. Front and center, just as you requested." I continued toward the boardroom, feeling the familiar weight of my accomplishments settling around me. The journey to this moment had been arduous and unexpected, a path I couldn't have imagined when I first joined Meridian as a junior software developer fresh out of college. Back then, Richard had recognized my talent, mentored me, valued my contributions. It wasn't until the company began to grow significantly that something shifted in his approach, that he began reimagining my role in his corporate narrative. Outside the Oasis room, named for its calming blue decor and subtle water features, I paused to gather my thoughts. Through the glass walls, I could see my executive team already seated. Marcus Chen, our brilliant CTO who had been the first to recognize the pattern of Richard taking credit for my work. Elena Rodriguez, our CFO whose meticulous financial strategies had made our recent restructuring possible. And Jordan Williams, our chief legal officer who had orchestrated the perfectly legal maneuvers that led to my current position. They were all here, not just as executives, but as witnesses to the culmination of a journey that had begun with a casual dismissal at a crucial investor meeting 18 months ago. That moment, that public diminishment, had been the catalyst that transformed me from a woman content to work in the shadows, to one determined to step into the light. I smoothed down my tailored navy suit, adjusting the delicate gold pin on my lapel. A small lighthouse, a gift from my grandmother when I graduated with my computer science degree. "Be the light that guides others," she had told me, not knowing how prophetic those words would become in my career. "Everything set?" Marcus asked as I entered the room, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Perfect," I confirmed, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Richard just confirmed he's on his—" Elena slid a folder toward me. "Latest valuation came in this morning. We're up another 12% since the announcement of the new security protocol." The new security protocol, my security protocol, the one Richard had dismissed as too ambitious and unnecessarily complex when I'd first proposed it 2 years ago. The same protocol that had recently been hailed as revolutionary by industry experts and had attracted the attention of 3 major government contractors. "I've prepared a summary of the acquisition process," Jordan added, his calm voice betraying none of the tension we'd all felt during those intense weeks of negotiation. "Just in case Richard has any questions about the legitimacy of the transition." I nodded, grateful for their support and foresight. "I doubt he'll challenge the legality. Richard has always understood power. What he'll struggle with is reconciling his perception of me with the reality of where we all are now." Through the glass walls, I watched the elevator doors open at the far end of the corridor. Richard stepped out, his confident stride immediately recognizable. He still moved like the owner of the space, his bespoke suit and perfectly coiffed silver hair projecting the success story he'd crafted about himself over decades. Beside him walked his new assistant, a young man who looked barely out of college, carrying a portfolio and nodding earnestly at whatever instructions Richard was giving. I felt a moment of déjà vu, remembering how often I had been in that same position, walking a step behind, taking notes, being introduced as my secretary Sophia, while my technical insights and strategic innovations were presented as Richard's brilliant ideas. "Here we go," Marcus murmured, straightening in his chair. Richard approached the glass doors, pausing briefly as he registered who was sitting at the head of the table. A slight furrow appeared between his eyebrows, the only indication that something wasn't aligning with his expectations. He had been told he would be meeting with Meridian's new executive team, but clearly, he hadn't been informed exactly who led that team. The door opened, and Richard entered with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "Good morning," he said, his gaze sweeping over us before settling on me with a hint of confusion. "I was expecting to meet with the new CEO." I smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle around us like a perfectly tailored garment. "You are, Richard. Thank you for coming in today." His expression shifted subtly, confusion giving way to disbelief as the implications of my position at the head of the table, surrounded by the executive team, began to register. The assistant behind him glanced between us, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice carefully controlled. "When my assistant scheduled this meeting with Meridian's new management team, I assumed—" "That's the thing about assumptions," I interjected smoothly. "They often reflect our own limitations rather than reality." I gestured to the chair directly across from me. "Please, have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss about Meridian's future and your potential ongoing relationship with the company you founded." As Richard slowly lowered himself into the chair, his gaze fixed on the letterhead samples positioned deliberately at the center of the table. There, in elegant, authoritative font, was the new Meridian Technologies logo, and beneath it, the names of the executive leadership team, with Sophia James, Chief Executive Officer, listed prominently at the top. The recognition in his eyes was worth more than any verbal acknowledgement could have been. In that moment, Richard's secretary ceased to exist, replaced by the woman whose vision would now guide the company forward. The woman whose name would appear on every official communication, every contract, every annual report. The woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the position her contributions had earned. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. One where recognition couldn't be denied, where contribution couldn't be diminished, and where the truth of who I was and what I had built would finally be acknowledged, not just by Richard, but by the entire industry we had helped shape. Richard's expression hardened as he processed the scene before him, his eyes darting between my face and the letterhead where my name and title were prominently displayed. The boardroom fell silent, the kind of weighted silence that occurs when power dynamics shift unexpectedly. "This is some kind of joke," he finally said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of dismissal I had heard countless times during my years at Meridian. "Sophia, What exactly is going on here? I maintained perfect composure, allowing myself to observe him with professional detachment. 5 years working closely with Richard had taught me to read the subtle indicators of his emotional state. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers tapped once against his thigh, the barely perceptible change in his breathing pattern. He was rattled but attempting to regain control through dismissal, his favored tactic when confronted, with something that challenged his worldview. "No joke, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and authoritative. Meridian Technologies underwent a significant restructuring 3 months ago. The board voted unanimously for new leadership following the Westlake acquisition. I gestured toward my executive team. "You've met Marcus and Elena before, I believe, and this is Jordan Williams, our chief legal officer." Richard ignored the introductions, his focus remaining fixed on me. "The Westlake acquisition? That was my deal. I've been working on that for over a year." "Actually," Elena interjected smoothly, sliding a folder across the table, "the Westlake acquisition was primarily architected by Sophia, as documented in these meeting minutes and strategic planning documents. Your initial approach was rejected by their board twice. It was Sophia's revised security integration strategy that ultimately made the deal viable." Richard didn't even glance at the folder. His jaw tightened as he addressed me directly, as if the others weren't present. "I groomed you for a leadership position, Sophia. I mentored you. But this is not what we discussed." What we had discussed was an eventual promotion to Chief Product Officer, a position that would have kept me firmly under Richard's authority while continuing to allow him to present my innovations as his own vision. It was a conversation that had occurred approximately 6 weeks before he had introduced me as his secretary at the Westlake initial meeting, effectively undermining any credibility I might have established independently with their executives. "Plans evolve, Richard," I replied calmly, as did Meridian's needs. The board felt the company required leadership that better understood the technical foundation of our products and could speak authentically about our security protocols to government clients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Richard's assistant shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly sensing he had walked into a situation far more complex than the routine meeting he had anticipated. He clutched his portfolio like a shield, uncertain whether to remain standing or find a seat. "Please sit down," I said to the young man, gesturing to an empty chair. "You may want to take notes. This meeting concerns Meridian's future direction and Mr. Harrington's potential consulting relationship with the company." "Consulting relationship?" Richard repeated, the words clearly tasting bitter on his tongue. "I founded Meridian. I built it from nothing." "You did found Meridian," I acknowledged, "and that contribution is valued. However, as these quarterly reports clearly indicate," I opened another folder containing colorful growth charts and financial projections. "The company's most significant growth occurred during the implementation of the Artemis Protocol and subsequent security framework, the innovations that now represent 78% of our revenue stream." I didn't need to explicitly state that the Artemis Protocol had been my creation, developed during weekends and evenings over the course of 18 months. Richard knew this, though he had presented it to clients and the board as his brainchild, with me characterized as merely executing his vision. The financial reports spoke the truth his words had obscured. Marcus leaned forward, his expression professional but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. He had been the first to recognize and quietly document the pattern of Richard taking credit for my work, creating a detailed timeline that eventually proved instrumental in persuading the board. "Richard, the security landscape has shifted dramatically in the past 2 years," Marcus explained. "Clients are increasingly demanding technical expertise from executive leadership, not just business acumen. They want to speak directly with the minds behind the security protocols protecting their data." Richard's gaze hardened. "And you believe Sophia provides that expertise better than I do?" It's not a belief, Elena responded, her economist's precision evident in her tone. It's documented fact. Since Sophia began conducting the technical portions of client presentations, rather than preparing you to deliver them, our conversion rate has increased by 64%. Clients respond to authentic expertise. Richard's expression remained skeptical, but a new calculation was clearly occurring behind his eyes. He had always been strategic, capable of reassessing when necessary. It was part of what had made him successful, this ability to pivot when a situation wasn't developing to his advantage. I see, he said, his tone modulating to something more measured. And the board approved this transition? Unanimously, Jordan confirmed, speaking, for the first time. The documentation was quite compelling, particularly when paired with the financial projections for the government sector expansion, a market that specifically requires the technical architects to be in leadership positions for security clearance purposes. Richard's assistant had begun taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across the page. I noticed Richard glance at the young man with subtle annoyance, perhaps recognizing for the first time how it appeared to have someone documenting his diminishment in real time. Jason, wait outside, Richard instructed curtly. Actually, I intervened. I'd prefer if Jason stays. Transparency is a core value of Meridian's new leadership approach. I smiled at the assistant. We have nothing to discuss that can't be properly documented. It was a small moment of correction, but a significant one. For years, Richard had controlled information flow, deciding who was present for which conversations, compartmentalizing knowledge in ways that maintained his position as the central node of the company's network. That approach had ended with my appointment. Richard's fingers tapped once against his thigh again, that tell I had observed countless times when he felt control slipping. He glanced around the table, perhaps searching for an ally among the executives, but found only professional, composure reflecting back at him. Fine, he conceded. Let's discuss this consulting arrangement then. I nodded, opening another folder. We value the relationships you've built over the years, Richard. Your networking abilities and business development skills remain assets, worth retaining. The board has approved a 12-month consulting contract focusing specifically on client relationship management for our non-technical accounts. I slid the contract across the table, watching as Richard registered the title, Senior Business Relations Consultant. A significant step down from founder and CEO, but still a position that acknowledged his strengths while clearly delineating the limits of his authority. The compensation package is on page 3, I continued. You'll find it's quite generous, reflecting both your past contributions and the value we believe you can still provide in a more focused role. Richard made no move to touch the contract. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze sharpening as he studied me with new awareness. You've been planning this for some time. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I've been delivering value to Meridian for 5 years, Richard. The only thing that's changed is the acknowledgement of that contribution. He nodded slowly, a gesture that contained neither acceptance nor defeat, but rather reassessment. And, if I decline this consulting position? That would be your prerogative, I replied evenly. But I should note that the non-compete clause in your original employment contract remains in effect for 18 months following your separation from Meridian. Jordan can provide a copy for your review if needed. Richard's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing options, considering angles, evaluating leverage. It was what made him an effective businessman, this ability to constantly recalibrate based on changing circumstances. You've thought of everything, he finally said, a note of reluctant respect entering his voice. Not everything, I corrected him. Just everything necessary to ensure Meridian's continued growth and success, which has always been my priority, regardless of how my contributions were characterized. The reference to his habitual misrepresentation of my role landed precisely as intended. A flicker of discomfort crossed Richard's face, perhaps the first acknowledgement, however subtle, that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. "You were always detail-oriented," he conceded, reaching for the contract at last. "I suppose I should have recognized the potential liability in that." "Not liability, Richard," I countered, my voice firm but not unkind. "Value. What you consistently failed to recognize was value, specifically the difference between building something yourself and taking credit for what others build." The boardroom fell silent again as Richard opened the contract, his expression unreadable as he began to scan the terms of his new, diminished relationship with the company he had founded. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the tableau we created. The former CEO confronting the new reality, the executive team presenting a unified front, and at the center of it all, the letterhead with my name that represented not just a personal victory, but a restoration of truth. Jason, still dutifully taking notes, glanced up at me with something like wonder in his expression. I recognized that look, the sudden realization that career paths could contain unexpected turns, that hierarchies were more fluid than they appeared, that competence and contribution could eventually overcome misrepresentation. It was a look of recalibration, of possibilities expanding in real time. And in that moment, I knew that regardless of Richard's decision about the consulting role, the most important message had already been delivered. Not just to him, but to everyone in the room. The message captured in the letterhead, in my position, at the head of the table, in the quiet confidence with which I now directed the company's future. The truth will find its voice, even when others attempt to silence it. Richard flipped through the consulting contract methodically, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed the details. I observed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the slight tension in his shoulders gradually relaxing, the calculating look in his eyes softening into something more contemplative. He was adapting, as successful business people must, reassessing his position in real time based on new information. "The terms are fair," he finally acknowledged, closing the folder. "More than fair, actually. Though I still don't understand how this happened so thoroughly without my awareness." I met his gaze directly, my posture relaxed but authoritative. "Perhaps because you were looking for threats in the wrong places, Richard. You were guarding against competitors, market shifts, technological disruptions, but not against the consequences of undervaluing the people closest to you." Something flickered across his face then, a moment of genuine introspection. Rare. For a man who typically externalized responsibility for setbacks, his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me with new attention, as if truly seeing me for the first time. "The Artemis Protocol presentation," he said slowly, referencing the government security conference from 8 months prior. "You wrote that entire framework, didn't you? Not just the technical specifications I had you prepare for me." "Yes," I confirmed simply, "as I did for the Westlake integration strategy, the quantum encryption roadmap, and the adaptive security architecture that now forms the foundation of our government contracts division." Richard's assistant, Jason, looked up from his notes, his eyes widening as he glanced between us. The realization was clearly dawning that he was witnessing something significant, a fundamental realignment of history as well as authority. "But you never objected," Richard countered, an edge of defensiveness entering his voice. "You prepared. Those briefings for me stood in the background during presentations, accepted being introduced as—" He stopped abruptly, perhaps hearing how the words would sound spoken aloud in this new context. "As your secretary," I finished for him, my voice level. "Yes, I did. For longer than I should have. That's on me, and it's a lesson I won't forget." Elena shifted slightly beside me, her expression neutral, but her eyes conveying support. She had been the first to directly question me about why I allowed the misrepresentation to continue, challenging me to recognize how my silence had enabled Richard's behavior. "Wait," Jason interjected, unable to contain himself despite professional protocol. "You're the one who designed the Artemis Protocol? The one that won the National Security Innovation Award last quarter?" Richard shot his assistant a sharp look, but I nodded acknowledgement. "Yes. Though when you view the acceptance speech from the ceremony, you'll see Richard thanking the team back at Meridian without specific attribution." Jason's confusion was evident as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. "But I've been helping prepare the technical briefings for the DoD meetings," Mr. Harrington always said. He trailed off, perhaps suddenly, conscious of the delicacy of his position. "It's all right, Jason," I assured him. "This moment isn't about assigning blame. It's about clarifying reality so we can all move forward productively." Richard cleared his throat, regaining his composure. With visible effort. "Sophia always had a gift for explaining complex security concepts," he offered, attempting to reframe the narrative even now. "I recognized her talent for technical documentation early on, which is why I had her prepare so many presentations." "Richard," I said, letting a hint of weariness enter my tone. "Please, not anymore." Something in my voice, not anger, not resentment, but simple, clear truth, seemed to finally penetrate. Richard fell silent, his customary confidence faltering, as the full implications of the situation settled around him. Marcus leaned forward, his expression professional, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "Perhaps this is a good moment to address the transition plan for Richard's clients. We've prepared a communication strategy that acknowledges his founding role, while introducing the technical leadership that's always been behind Meridian's innovations." Richard's gaze remained fixed on me, a new awareness dawning in his eyes. "It was the Delancey contract, wasn't it? When I introduced you as my secretary to their chief security officer. That's when something changed." The memory crystallized sharply. The Delancey Corporation's Riverside headquarters, their security team assembled for our presentation, Richard's casual introduction. "This is Sophia, my secretary. She'll be taking notes." The fleeting expression on the chief security officer's face, a dismissive glance, an immediate recategorization of my presence in the room from potential expert to administrative support. And then, most damaging, Richard presenting my adaptive security architecture as his brainchild, stumbling through technical questions while I sat silently with the answers he'd rehearsed but failed to internalize. That was a turning point, I acknowledged, though the pattern was established long before. Richard nodded slowly, something like genuine regret crossing his features. "You were brilliant that day," he admitted. "When they asked about quantum resistance in the encryption model and I couldn't remember the details, you slipped me that note with the perfect explanation. I thought I was being clever having you there as backup. I never considered." He trailed off, but the unfinished thought hung in the air. He never considered how it felt to be the architect relegated to passing notes from the sidelines, watching someone else take credit for your creation. "The past is instructive, but not defining," I said, consciously steering the conversation away from recrimination toward resolution. "What matters now is Meridian's future. You built something valuable, Richard. No one denies that. The question is whether you can adapt to a new role that honors your strengths, while acknowledging the full team that brought us to this point." Jordan slid another document across the table, a press release announcing Richard's transition to a senior advisory role while celebrating his legacy as founder. "We've prepared this for distribution next week. We'd welcome your input on the wording, of course." Richard skimmed the document, his expression thoughtful. "This is generous in its characterization." "It's truthful," I corrected. "You did found Meridian. You did establish our initial client base. You did identify key market opportunities. Those contributions aren't erased by the fact that others, that I, contributed significantly to our technical innovations. For the first time that morning, Richard's expression reflected something close to genuine respect as he regarded me across the table. "You're better at this than I expected," he said, the words falling somewhere between compliment and confession. "At what specifically?" I asked, holding his gaze. "Leadership," he replied after a moment. "Balance. I would have been more vindictive in your position." "Then perhaps the board made the right decision for reasons beyond technical expertise," I observed, allowing myself a small smile. Richard exhaled slowly, setting the press release beside the consulting contract. "So this is really happening. You're running Meridian now." "Yes," I confirmed simply. "Though running implies more top-down control than our new leadership model. We're implementing a collaborative executive structure that better leverages our collective expertise." "Sophia's vision for Meridian extends beyond product innovation," Elena added. "She's restructuring how we operate as an organization, more transparent, more collaborative, more equitable in how we recognize contributions." Richard absorbed this, his gaze moving from Elena to Marcus, then to Jordan, clearly reassessing. These people he had worked alongside, but perhaps never truly seen as equals. Finally, his attention returned to me, and I recognized the exact moment when his perception fundamentally shifted. When Sophia, my secretary, dissolved completely, and Sophia, the CEO, crystallized in its place. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, neither triumphant nor resentful. "You did." The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between us, not an accusation but a fact, a truth that had shaped both our professional trajectories and led us to this moment of reckoning. Jason shifted in his seat, still absorbing the implications of everything he had witnessed. His gaze moved between Richard and me, then down to the letterhead where my name and title were prominently displayed. I could almost see the mental recalibration happening as he processed how quickly perceptions could change, how dramatically power could shift, how thoroughly the assumed order could be upended. "The consulting contract includes full benefits and a flexible schedule," I continued, extending professional courtesy into what could have been an awkward silence. "We genuinely believe your relationship-building skills remain valuable to Meridian, particularly with our legacy clients who know you as the face of the company." Richard nodded, a decision crystallizing in his expression. "I'll need to review this with my attorney, of course." "Of course," Jordan affirmed. "We'd expect nothing less." "But tentatively," Richard continued, his voice finding its usual confidence, though now tempered with something new, perhaps humility, or at least pragmatism, "I think we can make this arrangement work." Relief subtly rippled through the room, not because we needed Richard's approval, but because a contentious separation would have consumed energy better directed toward Meridian's future. The company had been my professional home for 5 years. Despite everything, I wanted to preserve what was valuable in its foundation while building something more equitable on that base. "Excellent," I said, rising from my chair to signal the conclusion of this phase of our meeting. "Jordan's team will liaison with your attorney to finalize the details. In the meantime, we've prepared an overview of the transition announcement timeline and the communication strategy for clients." As I stood, the others followed suit, a small but significant demonstration of the new order. Richard remained, seated momentarily, perhaps absorbing this final visual confirmation of the leadership change, before slowly rising to his feet. "One question," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "When did you decide to make this move? Was there a specific moment when secretary to CEO became your goal?" I considered his question, recognizing its importance not just to Richard, but to my own understanding of the journey that had brought us to this moment. "It wasn't initially about becoming CEO," I answered truthfully. "It was about recognition, about aligning contribution with acknowledgement. The title became relevant only when I realized it was the most effective way to ensure that alignment for myself and for everyone at Meridian. Richard absorbed this, nodding slowly. "Well," he said finally, extending his hand across the table. "Congratulations, Sophia. It seems I taught you more than I realized." I accepted his handshake, firm and professional, neither dominant nor submissive. "You did teach me, Richard, though perhaps not always the lessons you intended." As our hands separated, a chapter closed and another opened, not just for me or for Richard, but for Meridian Technologies as a whole. The letterhead with my name was more than a symbol of personal achievement. It represented a fundamental shift in how value would be recognized and rewarded throughout the organization I now led. Richard gathered the contracts, inclining his head slightly toward the executive team in acknowledgement before turning to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "The market will be watching," he said, the words somewhere between warning and challenge. I met his gaze steadily. "Yes," I agreed. "They will, and they'll see what happens when innovation and recognition are properly aligned." As the door closed behind him, I turned to my executive team, the partners who had recognized the truth long before Richard had been forced to confront it. In their eyes, I saw not just professional respect, but something more valuable: recognition, freely given rather than extracted through position or authority. "Well," Marcus said, breaking the momentary silence, "that went better than we anticipated." "Indeed," I agreed, returning to my seat at the head of the table. "Now let's discuss how we actually deliver on the promises we just made. Meridian's story doesn't end with a new letterhead. It begins with one." My journey at Meridian Technologies began 5 years earlier, on a crisp autumn morning that promised new beginnings. Fresh from completing my master's degree in cybersecurity with a focus on quantum-resistant encryption algorithms, I arrived at Meridian's original headquarters, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that housed barely 30 employees at the time. Richard Harrington greeted me personally, his enthusiasm palpable as he led me through the open workspace. "Sophia, your thesis on post-quantum cryptography was exactly what we've been looking for," he said, gesturing expansively. "Most security firms are still focused on conventional encryption. They don't see the quantum threat horizon like we do." I remember feeling both validated and nervous, my academic research recognized by someone who had built a reputation for identifying technological inflection points before they became obvious to the mainstream market. Richard had founded Meridian 3 years earlier after leaving a senior position at a major tech conglomerate, determined to build a security company that anticipated threats rather than merely responding to them. "Your timing is perfect," Richard continued, stopping at a modest workstation positioned near his glass-walled office. "We just landed the Blackridge contract, major financial institution, very forward-thinking CISO. They specifically mentioned quantum-resistant protocols as a priority for their 5-year security roadmap." He introduced me to the small development team, just 6 engineers at that time, and outlined my initial responsibilities, reviewing their current security architecture and identifying potential vulnerabilities to quantum computing advancements. It was precisely the kind of work I had hoped for, applying theoretical models to practical security challenges. "Don't worry about the business side," Richard assured me. "That's my domain. You focus on the technical architecture, and we'll make a perfect team. Your expertise, my connections, Meridian will revolutionize how companies approach quantum security." Those early months established a collaborative rhythm that felt both productive and promising. Richard arranged meetings with potential clients, where he would handle the initial relationship building before bringing me in to explain the technical concepts that differentiated Meridian's approach. He had an undeniable talent for translating complex security principles into business value propositions that resonated with executives, while I provided the substantive expertise that validated those claims. "You've got a gift, Sophia," Richard observed after a particularly successful presentation to a healthcare conglomerate. "You explain quantum security in ways that don't terrify non-technical decision-makers. That's rare." The compliment warmed me, reinforcing my growing confidence in this new professional environment. I had worried that my academic background might be perceived as too theoretical for practical application, but Richard consistently highlighted the value my research-oriented mindset brought to Meridian's offerings. 6 months into my tenure, Richard approached me with an unexpected opportunity. "The Quantum Security Symposium in Boston. I want you to represent Meridian," he said, sliding the conference program across my desk. "Present our framework for transitioning legacy systems to quantum-resistant protocols. It's time we established Meridian as thought leaders in this space." The symposium represented a significant platform, an audience of security professionals, government officials, and academic researchers all focused on the emerging quantum computing challenge. I spent weeks developing the presentation, refining complex concepts into accessible frameworks while maintaining technical accuracy. "Run me through it one more time," Richard requested the evening before my departure for Boston. We sat in his office as I walked through the presentation slides, explaining the methodology for assessing quantum vulnerability and our phased approach to mitigation. "This is excellent work, Sophia," he said when I finished. "Truly groundbreaking. The approach to hybrid classical quantum transitional security, that's going to change how the industry thinks about quantum readiness." His approval bolstered my confidence as I traveled to Boston the next morning. The presentation was scheduled for the second day of the symposium, giving me time to attend other sessions and connect with peers in the field. I found myself engaged in stimulating conversations with researchers whose papers I had cited in my thesis, security architects facing similar challenges with legacy systems, and government officials tasked with establishing quantum security standards. When my presentation time arrived, I delivered the material with clarity and conviction, fielding technical questions afterward with the depth of knowledge that came from months of focused work. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Attendees approached me throughout the remainder of the symposium, business cards were exchanged, and potential partnerships discussed. I returned to Meridian energized and excited to share the connections I had made and the insights gathered from other presentations. Richard's office door was open when I arrived, and I knocked lightly on the frame. "Sophia, perfect timing," he called, gesturing me in. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit sat across from his desk. "Paul, this is Sophia James, our brilliant security architect I was telling you about." "Sophia, Paul Westbrook is CEO of Tidewater Financial. They're exploring a complete security overhaul with quantum considerations." I extended my hand, prepared to discuss the symposium later and focus on this prospective client. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Westbrook. Tidewater has some unique security challenges given your international transaction volume." Paul seemed mildly surprised as we shook hands. "You're familiar with our operations?" "Sophia makes it her business to understand potential clients before we even approach them," Richard interjected smoothly. "Part of what makes Meridian different, we do our homework." In truth, I had researched several financial institutions during my thesis work, analyzing their public security disclosures to identify patterns in their approach to emerging threats. Tidewater had been one of my case studies, but Richard's characterization made it sound like a company directive rather than my personal academic interest. "I'd love to hear more about your quantum security framework," Paul said, turning fully toward me. "Richard mentioned you just presented at the Boston Symposium?" Before I could respond, Richard laughed lightly. "Let's not get too technical." "Too quickly, Paul. Why don't you continue your tour of our operations, and we can schedule a dedicated technical briefing once we've established the partnership parameters." The moment passed quickly, but it left a subtle impression, a slight redirection away from my direct engagement with the client. At the time, I rationalized it as Richard's expertise in client management, his understanding of how to pace the relationship-building process. As Paul was escorted to meet with other team members, Richard turned to me with genuine enthusiasm. "The symposium was a tremendous success," he said. "I've already heard from 2 different contacts who were impressed. With Meridian's quantum security position, your presentation clearly made an impact." "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied. "The questions afterward were particularly valuable, helped me identify some areas where our framework needs refinement." "That's what I love about your approach, Sophia," Richard said warmly. "Always improving, never satisfied with good enough. It's why I brought you onto the team." In these early interactions, Richard demonstrated a quality I would later recognize as strategically calibrated appreciation, enough recognition to maintain motivation, carefully measured to encourage continued contribution without establishing independent authority. It was a subtle art, one I wouldn't fully comprehend until much later. The weeks following the symposium brought a notable increase in prospective client inquiries, many specifically mentioning quantum security preparedness. Richard leveraged this momentum effectively, scheduling a series of presentations with potential clients across various industries. "We need to standardize our approach," he explained during a planning meeting. "I'll handle the business case and relationship management. Sophia, you'll prepare the technical briefings for me to deliver. We need to translate your expertise into language C-suite executives can understand without getting lost in the quantum mechanics." This division of responsibilities seemed logical at the time. Richard had years of experience presenting to executive teams, while I was still developing those skills. I channeled my energy into creating comprehensive briefing documents, technical specifications, and presentation materials that conveyed complex security concepts in accessible terms. Our first major success came 3 months later when Tidewater Financial signed a 2-year security consulting contract. The announcement breathed new life into Meridian, enabling Richard to hire additional staff and expand our office space. "This is just the beginning," Richard declared during the modest celebration he organized. Raising his glass toward me across the room, he added, "Sophia's quantum security architecture is going to revolutionize how financial institutions approach data protection." The public acknowledgement was gratifying, validating the countless hours I had invested in developing the framework. Yet even then, I noticed a subtle distinction in how Richard characterized my contribution, not as the architect of our security approach, but as a valuable resource that Meridian, and by extension, Richard himself, was strategically deploying. This pattern would repeat and intensify as Meridian grew over the subsequent year. My role expanded to include managing a small team of security specialists, all while continuing to develop increasingly sophisticated protocols and frameworks. Richard's focus shifted toward business development and company growth, relying on me to maintain the technical foundation upon which Meridian's reputation was building. Our working relationship maintained its productive balance until the Edison Banking Group presentation, the first significant shift in how Richard positioned me to external partners. As we prepared to enter the conference room where Edison's executive team awaited our proposal, Richard turned to me with a last-minute directive. "Let's simplify today. There are too many people in the room already," he said, his tone casual but brooking no discussion. "Just take notes on their technical requirements, and we'll address those in the follow-up. I'll handle the presentation." Before I could object, he was opening the door, greeting the Edison executives with practiced charm. "Good morning, everyone. Richard Harrington, CEO of Meridian Technologies." Gesturing briefly toward me as I found a seat at the periphery of the conference table, he added, "This is Sophia, my secretary. She'll be capturing your specifications so we can customize our solution." The introduction landed like a sudden weight, shocking in its deliberate mischaracterization. For a moment, I considered correcting him, but the presentation was already beginning, the projector displaying the slides I had prepared, Richard launching into the security framework I had architected as if it were his own creation. I sat silently, notebook open, pen in hand, watching as my work was presented without attribution. More disorienting than the misrepresentation itself was the ease with which it was delivered. Not a spontaneous mistake, but a deliberate repositioning, suggesting this new characterization had been contemplated in advance. When technical questions arose that extended beyond the prepared material, Richard smoothly deferred. "Excellent question. We'll need to consult with our technical team and provide a detailed response in the follow-up documentation." These questions, about implementation specifics, integration challenges, and protocol adaptations, were precisely the areas where my expertise would have added immediate value. Instead, opportunities for substantive engagement were postponed, my role reduced to transcription rather than contribution. The meeting concluded with expressions of interest from Edison's team and promises of detailed follow-up materials addressing their specific concerns. As we gathered our materials to leave, Edison's CIO approached me directly. "Those were excellent notes you were taking," he commented. "Will you be the one preparing the follow-up documentation?" Before I could respond, Richard inserted himself between us with practiced smoothness. "My technical team will handle that, Mark. Sophia keeps everything organized for me. Invaluable for making sure no requirement falls through the cracks." The exchange was brief but illuminating, establishing a pattern that would become increasingly familiar in subsequent client interactions. What I couldn't understand then, what would take months to fully comprehend, was why Richard had chosen to diminish my perceived role despite the clear value my expertise brought to these engagements. I confronted him that evening, choosing my words carefully as we debriefed in his office. "I was surprised by how you introduced me today," I began, keeping my tone neutral, professional. "I think the Edison team would have benefited from knowing my actual role in developing the security architecture." Richard looked genuinely surprised, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Did I misintroduce you?" "I wasn't thinking about titles, just trying to keep the room focused on the big picture. Too many cooks, you know?" His response was so smoothly delivered, so seemingly reasonable that it momentarily made me question my own reaction. Was I being overly sensitive? Had I misinterpreted his intention? "I'm not concerned about titles," I clarified. "But when technical questions came up about the architecture I designed, it would have been more efficient if I could have addressed them directly." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. That's a good point for future presentations. I get so focused on maintaining the client relationship that sometimes I overthink the dynamics." He smiled warmly. "Next time, we'll make sure your technical expertise is properly positioned. Your work is the backbone of what we're offering. I never want you to think I don't recognize that." The conversation ended with what felt like mutual understanding, his acknowledgement apparently sincere. Yet the pattern would not only continue, but intensify in subsequent client engagements, a gradual erosion of my visible role that contrasted sharply with my expanding responsibilities behind the scenes. The contradiction between private recognition and public diminishment became the defining paradox of my early years at Meridian, a tension that would eventually catalyze the transformation neither of us could have anticipated when we first shook hands in that converted warehouse office. 5 years earlier, the Delancey Corporation meeting marked the undeniable turning point in my relationship with Richard and my future at Meridian Technologies. It happened 18 months after I joined the company, on a day that began with unusual promise. Delancey represented a potential breakthrough client, a multinational corporation with government contracts that would require the highest level of security certification. Securing them would not only boost Meridian's revenue significantly, but establish us as players in the elite tier of security providers. The stakes were substantial, and both Richard and I knew it. The morning of the presentation, Richard called me into his office earlier than usual. His energy was palpable as he paced behind his desk, fine-tuning his talking points. "This is the one, Sophia," he said, his excitement evident. Delancey could triple our government sector presence overnight. Their CISO is bringing their entire security leadership team. They want the deep technical dive. He paused, placing his hands on the desk. I need you at your absolute best today. His words filled me with cautious optimism. After months of being increasingly sidelined during client presentations, this acknowledgement of my technical expertise seemed like a potential return to our earlier, more collaborative approach. I've prepared comprehensive materials on our quantum-resistant architecture, I assured him, including the simulation results from last week's penetration testing. The metrics are exceptional, better than we projected. Perfect, Richard Forer nodded approvingly. This is exactly why we make such a strong team. Your technical brilliance, my relationship management. He checked his watch. Their team arrives at 10 Baug. Let's meet in the conference room at 9:30 for a final run-through. I spent the morning refining the presentation, ensuring the technical material was both comprehensive and accessible. The Artemis Protocol, named after the Greek goddess of protection, represented months of intensive development work by my team and me. It was our most advanced security framework yet, incorporating adaptive responses to quantum computing vulnerabilities that were miles ahead of industry standards. At precisely 9:30, I arrived at the main conference room with my materials prepared. Richard was already there, reviewing his notes with focused intensity. He looked up as I entered, his expression brightening. There she is. Meridian's secret weapon, he said with a smile. Let's go through the sequence one more time. I'll handle the introduction and business case, then transition to the technical architecture. Would you like me to present the technical section? I asked, seeing an opportunity to establish a more balanced dynamic. I can address their security team's questions directly, especially about implementation specifics. Richard hesitated, briefly. Let's play that by ear, he replied, non-committal. Some of these government-adjacent clients respond better to a unified presentation voice. What matters is landing the contract, right? Before I could press further, his assistant appeared at the door. Mr. Harrington, Delancey's team has arrived early. They're in the reception area. Excellent. Nothing shows seriousness like punctuality. Richard gathered his materials. Let's welcome them properly. We proceeded to the reception area, where Richard greeted the Delancey contingent with practiced charm. Their Chief Information Security Officer, Alexandra Winters, led a team of 5 security specialists, all of whom carried the focused expression of people who made decisions based on substance rather than salesmanship. Alexandra, wonderful. To meet you in person finally, Richard said, shaking her hand warmly. I'm Richard Harrington, CEO of Meridian Technologies. After exchanging pleasantries, he gestured toward me without quite making eye contact. This is Sophia, my secretary. She'll be taking notes during our discussion. The words landed like a physical blow, unexpected despite the pattern that had been developing. Not my assistant, which would have been misleading enough, but my secretary, a deliberate diminishment that erased both my expertise and my actual position as head of product development. The Delancey team barely glanced in my direction, my relevance instantly diminished by Richard's characterization. Only Alexandra held my gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face before Richard smoothly guided the group toward the conference room. I followed silently, my mind racing to understand the strategic calculation behind this misrepresentation. Was Richard concerned that my expertise might overshadow his authority? Did he worry about clients developing direct relationships with Meridian's technical leadership? Or was it simply habit now, this erasure of my contributions? In the conference room, I took a seat at the periphery while Richard positioned himself at the head of the table. As the presentation began, I watched him navigate through the slides I had created, explaining concepts I had developed, presenting research my team had conducted, all without attribution, all with the confident authority of someone claiming ownership through presentation. The Delancey team listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that Richard answered with the talking points I had prepared for him. The presentation progressed smoothly until they reached the technical core of the Artemis Protocol, the adaptive response mechanisms that represented our most innovative work. "This looks promising," Alexandra commented, leaning forward with increased interest. "But I have concerns about implementation across legacy systems with varying encryption standards. How does the protocol manage quantum vulnerable entry points during the transition period?" It was a sophisticated question that cut to the heart of real-world implementation challenges, exactly the kind of substantive issue that demonstrated Delancey's technical sophistication and required an equally sophisticated response. Richard hesitated, momentarily uncertain. We had covered this in our preparation materials, but the specific details involved technical nuances that required deep understanding of the protocol's architecture. "An excellent question," he began, falling back on his standard technique of complimenting the questioner while composing his thoughts. "The transition period does indeed present unique challenges." As he spoke in increasingly general terms, I could see the Delancey team exchanging glances. Their security specialists were recognizing the shift from specific technical explanation to generalized reassurance, a red flag for technically astute clients. I quickly jotted down the precise answer, complete with the 3-phase implementation strategy we had developed specifically for heterogeneous legacy environments. Sliding the note discreetly toward Richard, I provided him the lifeline needed to recover credibility with this crucial client. Richard glanced at my note, seamlessly, incorporating the information into his response without breaking stride. As I was saying, we address this through a 3-phase implementation strategy that isolates quantum vulnerable access points while maintaining operational continuity. The tension in the room dissipated as he delivered the substantive answer, with the Delancey team visibly re-engaging with the presentation. Richard continued with renewed confidence, occasionally glancing my way when technical questions arose, not to invite my contribution, but to ensure I was preparing the necessary notes to guide his responses. This dynamic continued throughout the presentation, moments of technical depth where Richard would momentarily falter, my hasty notes providing the substance he needed, his smooth delivery creating the illusion of comprehensive expertise. When the formal presentation concluded, Alexandra asked the question I had been anticipating. "Your approach to quantum-resistant encryption is innovative, particularly the adaptive authentication protocols. Who heads up your technical development team? We'd like to have some direct conversations with them about implementation specifics if we move forward." The question created a moment of perfect opportunity, a chance for Richard to acknowledge my role and establish the authentic, technical leadership that would strengthen Meridian's position with this sophisticated client. Instead, he smiled confidently. "We have an exceptional development team that works under my direct guidance. All technical questions can come straight to me, and I'll ensure you receive comprehensive responses. I believe in maintaining a single point of contact for clients of Delancey's caliber. It streamlines communication and ensures nothing falls through the cracks." Alexandra's expression revealed subtle disappointment, a recognition that the technical depth she sought might not be as directly accessible as she had hoped. "I see," she said, her tone measured. "In our experience, direct access to technical leadership can accelerate implementation and troubleshooting." "Completely understandable," Richard replied smoothly. "Rest assured, all technical expertise is available to you through our established channels. Effective communication is one of Meridian's core strengths." The meeting concluded with expressions of interest, but without the enthusiastic commitment we had hoped for. As the Delancey team gathered their materials, Alexandra approached me, directly while Richard was engaged with one of her colleagues. "You took very detailed notes," she observed, her gaze assessing. "Technical background yourself?" Before I could respond honestly, Richard materialized beside us with remarkable timing. "Sophia is exceptionally thorough," he interjected. "Captures everything perfectly, which allows me to focus entirely on our client's needs." Alexandra nodded, politely, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, thank you both for the presentation. We'll be in touch after our team reviews the materials." After escorting the Delancey team out, Richard returned to the conference room where I remained, organizing my notes with mechanical precision while processing what had just transpired. "That went well," Richard declared, loosening his tie with a satisfied expression. "Your notes saved the day on those technical questions. See? This is why we make such an effective team. You anticipate what I need before I even know I need it." I looked up from my papers, meeting his gaze directly. "They wanted to speak with the technical leadership, Richard. That was a perfect opportunity to clarify my actual role." His expression shifted subtly, a momentary calculation visible before he responded. "Sophia, these government-adjacent clients expect a certain corporate structure. They want to know the CEO has complete command of the product. Introducing additional decision-makers creates unnecessary complexity." "I'm not an additional decision-maker," I countered, keeping my voice level despite the frustration building within me. "I'm the person who designed the security architecture they're considering implementing. My team developed the Artemis protocol. Acknowledging that isn't complicating things. It's being truthful about who does what at Meridian." Richard sighed, adopting the patient tone he used when explaining what he considered business realities. "This is standard practice in enterprise sales. Clients aren't buying individual contributors. They're buying Meridian technologies, our reputation, our support infrastructure, our commitment to their security. Personalization introduces unnecessary variables. Introducing me as your secretary isn't avoiding personalization," I said, the words finally breaking through my professional restraint. "It's misrepresenting both my role and my contributions. It diminishes Meridian's greatest strength, our technical expertise." For a moment, Richard looked genuinely startled by my directness. Then his expression hardened slightly. "I built Meridian from nothing, Sophia. Everything we've accomplished, the client base, the reputation, the growth trajectory, comes from my approach to client relationships. If you find that approach uncomfortable, perhaps we should discuss whether Meridian is the right fit for your career goals." The implied threat hung in the air between us, subtle but unmistakable. After nearly 2 years of invested work, of nights and weekends developing the protocols that were now Meridian's most valuable intellectual property, my continued employment was being conditioned on accepting deliberate misrepresentation of my role and contributions. "I need to think about this," I said finally, gathering my materials with deliberate calm. "Of course," Richard replied, his tone softening immediately. "Take the weekend. I understand this can feel personal, but business requires certain compromises. Your technical contributions are invaluable, Sophia. I hope you know how much I respect your abilities." I left the conference room without further comment, my mind already processing not just what had happened, but what it revealed about the fundamental disconnect between contribution and recognition at Meridian, a disconnect that extended beyond my personal situation to a broader structural issue. The weekend passed in a state of focused clarity rather than emotional turmoil. I reviewed my contributions to Meridian, the intellectual property I had developed, the client relationships that depended on my technical expertise even when filtered through Richard's presentation. I considered my options, leaving to start over elsewhere, accepting the status quo in exchange for continued employment, or finding another path that honored both my work and my worth. By Monday morning, I had reached no definitive conclusion, but I had developed a clearer understanding of what I needed, not just acknowledgement of my contributions, but structural alignment between value creation and value recognition for myself and for every member of Meridian's team. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, preparing for a candid conversation with Richard. But when I checked my email, a message awaited that would alter the trajectory of both our professional lives. Alexandra Winters from Delancey had requested a private meeting, not with Richard, but specifically with me. Her message was direct and unambiguous. Ms. James, based on preliminary research into Meridian's security patents and published research, I believe we need to speak directly about your role in developing the Artemis Protocol. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange a confidential meeting. This unexpected communication, this recognition from an external source of the truth Richard had worked so diligently to obscure, became the catalyst for everything that followed. It was the moment when invisibility became untenable, when the gap between contribution and recognition became too wide to bridge through conventional channels. It was, though I didn't recognize it immediately, the first step on the path that would eventually lead to my name appearing on Meridian's letterhead, not as an act of vengeance, but as a restoration of truth that would ultimately benefit not just me, but everyone whose value deserved honest acknowledgement. Alexandra Winters' email changed everything. After staring at the message for several minutes, processing its implications, I closed my office door, a rarity for me, and called the number she had provided. Ms. Winters, this is Sophia James from Meridian Technologies. Ms. James, she responded, her tone warm but professional. Thank you for returning my call so promptly. I suspect you understand why I reached out directly. I have some idea, I acknowledged, keeping my voice low despite the closed door. But I'd appreciate hearing your perspective. Certainly, Alexandra replied. After our meeting yesterday, something didn't align. The presentation contained sophisticated technical architecture that seemed at odds with your CEO's understanding of implementation specifics. When he introduced you as his secretary, I noticed your expression, brief but telling. She paused momentarily before continuing. As part of our standard due diligence, we researched Meridian's security patents. Your name appears as lead inventor on the core methodologies of what Mr. Harrington presented as the Artemis Protocol. The documentation trail is quite clear. My heart raced despite my outward calm. This external validation of what I had experienced internally was both vindicating and terrifying. Delancey's diligence had uncovered the truth Richard had worked so diligently to obscure, but acknowledging this reality to an external party carried significant professional risk. Ms. Winters, Alexandra, please. Alexandra, I continued, choosing my words with careful precision. You've placed me in a complicated position. I am deeply committed to Meridian's success and believe our security protocols would serve Delancey exceptionally well. I understand your position, she said, and I'm not asking you to compromise your professional loyalties. Quite the opposite, in fact. Delancey values authentic expertise. We need to know we're working directly with the minds behind the technologies protecting our data. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before adding, This isn't just about titles or recognition, Ms. James. It's about effectiveness. Implementation of security protocols this sophisticated requires ongoing dialogue with their architects. Filtered communication creates vulnerability. Her framing shifted my perspective subtly but significantly. This wasn't merely a personal slight, but a practical business concern. Misrepresentation wasn't just unfair, it was inefficient and potentially dangerous in the security context, where precision and expertise directly impacted effectiveness. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. A private meeting, Alexandra replied. Just you and I, discussing the technical specifics of the Artemis Protocol implementation without intermediaries. My evaluation goes to Delancey's board next week. Their decision will hinge significantly on my assessment of Meridian's technical capabilities, which it appears means your capabilities. The opportunity and dilemma were equally clear. Meeting privately with Delancey's CISO would likely infuriate Richard if he discovered it, potentially jeopardizing my position at Meridian. Not meeting could cost Meridian its most significant potential client, and me the opportunity to have my work properly recognized by an industry leader. I can meet tomorrow morning, I decided. There's a coffee shop called Ember Plus Sage about 3 blocks from your offices. Would 7:30 work? Perfect, Alexandra confirmed. And Ms. James? Bring the technical documentation you're comfortable sharing. No slides, no polished presentations, just the substantive architecture. That's what will determine our decision. After ending the call, I sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what I had just arranged. For the first time in my tenure at Meridian, I would be directly representing my work to a major client without Richard's filtering or reframing. The prospect was both exhilarating and daunting. The next morning, I arrived at Ember Sage 30 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. I had spent hours the previous evening preparing materials that described the Artemis protocol accurately without disclosing proprietary implementation details, a delicate balance that respected both Meridian's intellectual property and Delancey's need for thorough understanding. Alexandra arrived precisely at 7:30, dressed more casually than during our office meeting, but projecting the same focused intelligence. After ordering coffee, she joined me at the corner table, her expression open but evaluative. Thank you for meeting like this, she began. I realize it places you in a potentially awkward position with your CEO. Meridian's success is my priority, I replied, neither confirming nor denying the implied tension. And securing Delancey as a client would significantly advance that success. Alexandra nodded, seeming to appreciate my diplomatic approach. Let's focus on the technical specifics then. My primary concern involves the adaptive authentication matrix you've developed. The concept is innovative, but the implementation across heterogeneous systems presents considerable challenges. For the next 2 hours, we engaged in the most honest and technically sophisticated professional conversation I had experienced since joining Meridian. There were no simplified explanations, no gloss or marketing language, just substantive discussion between security experts addressing real-world implementation challenges. I found myself energized by the exchange, by the opportunity to defend and explain my work directly, to receive informed feedback from someone who truly understood the technical complexities involved. Alexandra asked penetrating questions that pushed me to articulate aspects of the protocol I had previously taken for granted, revealing both strengths and potential vulnerabilities in my approach. This is precisely what I needed, Alexandra said as our meeting concluded. Your understanding of quantum-resistant architecture is exceptional, Ms. James, particularly your approach to transitional vulnerability management during implementation. She gathered her notes, her expression becoming more measured. I'll be direct with you. Delancey is prepared to move forward with Meridian, but with a specific condition. You personally must lead the implementation team, not oversee it from a distance, not consult on it. Lead it directly, with clear authority and accessibility. The condition landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of both opportunity and complication. That would require a significant shift in how Meridian currently structures client relationships, I noted carefully. Yes, Alexandra agreed without hesitation. It would, and that's non-negotiable for us. Security architecture this sophisticated requires direct access to its creator. The protocol's adaptive nature means implementation decisions have cascading effects that only its architect can fully anticipate. She paused, studying my expression. The question, Ms. James, is whether Meridian values securing Delancey as a client enough to restructure its approach. My recommendation to our board will directly reflect your answer. I took a measured breath, weighing both professional obligation and personal integrity. I'll need to discuss this with Richard, I said finally. This represents a fundamental change to our established client relationship model. Of course, Alexandra nodded. I understand the corporate realities involved, but I should be clear, our interest is specifically in your expertise. If that expertise isn't directly accessible in the implementation phase, there are other security firms eager for our business. As we parted ways outside the coffee shop, Alexandra offered one final observation that would resonate long after our meeting concluded. Technical brilliance deserves proper attribution, Ms. James, not just for recognition's sake, but because obscuring the source of innovation inevitably diminishes its impact and evolution. Think about that as you consider your path forward. I returned to Meridian that morning with conflicting emotions swirling beneath my composed exterior. The validation from a respected industry peer had crystallized what I had sensed but never fully articulated. The misalignment between contribution and recognition wasn't just personally unfair, it was professionally counterproductive, limiting both individual potential and organizational effectiveness. Richard was waiting in my office when I arrived, his expression unreadable as I entered. For a brief, panicked moment, I wondered if he somehow knew about my meeting with Alexandra. But his first words dispelled that concern. Delancey's CISO just called, he said without preamble. They want to move forward with implementation, but they have unusual requests about team structure. I set my bag down carefully, buying a moment to compose my response. What kind of requests? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. They're insisting that you lead the implementation team directly, not just advise or oversee. Lead, with client-facing authority. He leaned forward in his chair. Alexandra Winters specifically referenced your technical expertise with the Artemis Protocol. She seemed remarkably familiar with your role in its development. The implicit question hung in the air between us. I could deflect, minimize, prevaricate, or I could confront the fundamental misalignment that had been growing since my earliest days at Meridian. The Artemis Protocol is my creation, Richard, I said simply. I'm listed as lead inventor on all the patents. It's natural that a technically sophisticated client like Delancey would research that before committing to implementation. Richard's expression tightened. You know, that's not how we structure client relationships at Meridian. We present a unified front, a single point of contact. It maintains clarity and control. It also obscures the actual source of innovation, I countered, Alexandra's parting observation giving me unexpected courage, which apparently matters to clients, like Delancey, who want direct access to technical expertise. This isn't about you personally, Richard said, his tone shifting to the patient explanation he used when explaining business realities to technical staff. It's about consistent client experience and expectation management. When you fragment authority, you create confusion. I considered his words carefully, recognizing the fundamental disconnect in our perspectives. Is acknowledging accurate roles fragmenting authority, Richard? Or is it simply being truthful about who does what at Meridian? His expression hardened slightly. This isn't academia, Sophia. In business, perception shapes reality. Clients aren't buying individual contributors. They're buying Meridian technologies. Delancey seems to be specifically buying my expertise, I noted quietly. They've made that explicit in their conditions for moving forward. Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window before turning back to face me. This creates a problematic precedent. If we restructure for Delancey, other clients will expect similar arrangements. The entire client relationship model would need to be reconsidered. His concern was valid from his perspective, a perspective that prioritized control and centralized authority. But it revealed something crucial. Richard wasn't just protecting Meridian's client relationship model, he was protecting his position within that model as the sole face of the company's innovation. Perhaps, I suggested carefully, the model needs reconsideration if it's preventing us from securing clients like Delancey. Expertise-driven innovation might require expertise-recognized implementation. Richard studied me with new awareness, perhaps recognizing for the first time that my perspective represented not just personal ambition, but a fundamentally different approach to value creation and recognition. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Delancey is potentially our largest client yet. Losing them over organizational structure would be unfortunate, but upending our entire approach to client relationships requires careful consideration." After he left my office, I sat quietly, processing the conversation. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in my relationship with Richard, but in my understanding of my own worth and how that worth should be recognized and leveraged. Within Meridian's structure, Alexandra's validation had provided external confirmation of what I had known internally, but hesitated to fully claim. My technical innovations were Meridian's most valuable assets, and restricting direct access to the mind behind those innovations was ultimately self-defeating for everyone involved. As I turned to my computer to document the morning's events, an email notification appeared, a message from Marcus Chen, our brilliant but often overlooked network architecture specialist. The subject line was simple but provocative. "Recognition, misalignment, not just you." The message that followed would become the catalyst for the most significant transformation in Meridian's history. Not just for me personally, but for every individual whose contributions had been systematically obscured by the very structure designed to leverage them. "Sophia," Marcus had written, "I've observed your interaction with Richard concerning attribution. You're not alone. Multiple team members have experienced similar disconnects between contribution and recognition. Perhaps it's time we discuss structural solutions rather than individual accommodations. If you're open to that conversation, several of us are ready for it. Innovation deserves proper attribution, not just for recognition's sake, but because obscuring the source inevitably diminishes its impact and evolution." The final sentence, an almost exact echo of Alexandra's parting observation, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The misalignment at Meridian wasn't simply a personal friction between Richard and me. It was a systemic issue affecting multiple contributors, limiting both individual potential and organizational effectiveness. This realization marked the true beginning of the aftermath, not just processing personal disappointment, but recognizing a structural problem that required a structural solution. It was the moment when individual frustration began transforming into collective purpose, when personal ambition evolved into organizational vision. The path forward would not be simple or straightforward. It would require strategic thinking, careful alliance building, and a fundamental reimagining of how value was created and recognized within Meridian's structure. But for the first time since the Delancey presentation, I felt something beyond frustration or vindication. I felt possibility, the possibility of creating something better, not just for myself, but for everyone whose contributions deserved honest acknowledgement. It was this possibility that would ultimately guide every decision in the months ahead, leading eventually to that moment in the boardroom when Richard would confront the letterhead bearing my name and title, not as an act of revenge, but as the visible manifestation of a necessary correction, the realignment of contribution and recognition that would ultimately strengthen not just individual careers, but Meridian itself. Marcus's email became the catalyst for a fundamental shift in my perspective. Until that moment, I had viewed the attribution issue as a personal conflict between Richard and me, a matter of individual recognition. The realization that others throughout Meridian experienced similar disconnects transformed my understanding of the situation entirely. This wasn't merely about my name on presentations. It was about a systemic structural problem affecting the entire organization's ability to recognize and leverage its greatest assets, the people creating its innovations. That evening, I met Marcus at a small restaurant several blocks from the office. He had suggested meeting off-site, away from Meridian's glass walls and potential observers. When I arrived, I found him seated at a corner table with Elena Rodriguez, our brilliant financial analyst whose economic modeling had made our government sector pricing both competitive and sustainable. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said as I joined them. I wasn't sure if my email was too forward. "It was exactly what I needed to hear," I replied honestly. "I've been so focused on my situation with Richard that I missed the broader pattern." Elena nodded, her typically reserved expression softening slightly. "Most of us experience it individually and assume it's personal. It took Marcus connecting the dots to help us see the systemic nature of the problem." Marcus opened his laptop, turning the screen toward me. "I've been documenting attribution patterns at Meridian for the past 14 months. Initially just out of curiosity, then with growing concern." The spreadsheet displayed a meticulous record of innovations, presentations, client communications, and internal attributions. Names in the creator column rarely matched those in the presenter or attributed to columns. The pattern was undeniable. Technical innovations consistently originated with specialized team members, but were presented externally, and often internally, as Richard's vision or under general Meridian branding that obscured individual contributions. "This isn't just about credit," Marcus explained, his normally quiet voice carrying unusual intensity. "It's about effectiveness. When the people who create innovations aren't recognized or directly accessible, implementation suffers. Clients receive filtered information, feedback loops break, evolution stalls." Elena pulled out several financial reports, her analytical mind translating the human issue into economic terms. "I've mapped the financial implications. Projects where originators maintain direct client contact show 34% higher implementation success rates and 47% higher client retention than those filtered through Richard's preferred model." The data validated what I had felt intuitively but couldn't previously quantify. Recognition wasn't just about personal satisfaction. It was about organizational effectiveness. Misalignment between contribution and attribution wasn't merely unfair, it was inefficient, limiting Meridian's potential in measurable, significant ways. "We're not the only ones who've noticed," Elena continued. 3 security architects have left Meridian in the past year, all citing limited growth opportunity in their exit interviews. 2 now work at competitor firms where their names appear on the protocols they develop. This revelation hit particularly hard. The realization that Meridian was losing valuable talent directly because of its attribution structure. "Have either of you spoken to Richard about this?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. Marcus exchanged glances with Elena before responding. "Individually, yes. He listens politely, acknowledges contributions internally, promises to consider changes, then continues with the same approach. The pattern never fundamentally shifts." "Until Delancey," Elena noted. "Their insistence on direct access to you represents the first significant external pressure on Richard's model. It's a potential inflection point. But even if Richard concedes on Delancey specifically, the structural problem remains," Marcus observed. "One exception doesn't change the system." He was right, of course. Even if Richard allowed me to lead the Delancey implementation directly, it would be treated as an isolated exception rather than a fundamental recalibration of how Meridian recognized and leveraged expertise. "So, what are you suggesting?" I asked, sensing they had already considered potential approaches. Elena closed her financial reports with deliberate precision. "We need structural change, not individual accommodation. Recognition alignment needs to be institutionalized, not negotiated case by case." "We've been researching alternative organizational models," Marcus added, pulling up another document on his laptop. "Firms that thrive specifically because they elevate rather than obscure their technical leaders. The data is compelling. They consistently outperform traditional hierarchical structures in innovation-driven fields. As they outlined various approaches, I found myself mentally categorizing: too confrontational, too gradual, too dependent on Richard's voluntary participation. Each had strengths, but none seemed to address the fundamental power dynamic at play. Richard had built Meridian. Its current structure reflected his vision and secured his position. Any approach that required him to voluntarily diminish his centrality seemed unlikely to succeed. These are all thoughtful approaches, I acknowledged, but they share a common vulnerability. They depend on Richard recognizing and accepting the need for structural change. His response to Delancey suggests he sees this as a problem to manage rather than a system to transform. Elena nodded, her analytical mind already processing this observation. You're identifying a principal-agent problem. Richard's interests as the central figure in the current structure don't align with the organization's interest in optimizing innovation attribution. Exactly, I agreed. So any viable approach needs to address that misalignment directly. It can't depend on Richard's willing participation, at least not initially. A moment of silence settled over the table as we considered the implications of this reality. We weren't discussing a friendly reorganization. We were contemplating a fundamental realignment of power within Meridian, a restructuring that Richard would likely resist rather than embrace. There might be another approach, Marcus said finally, his voice quieter but more resolute. One that leverages Meridian's corporate structure rather than confronting Richard directly. He explained that during his documentation process, he had discovered something noteworthy about Meridian's founding. Richard had initially raised capital through several angel investors who collectively held 38% of the company's shares. These investors had remained passive, trusting Richard's leadership as Meridian grew, but their equity positions gave them significant potential influence if activated. The investors care about returns, not management structure, Elena observed, her financial mind immediately grasping the implication. If we could demonstrate that the current attribution model is limiting growth and valuation, we'd need compelling evidence, I noted, not just reasonable arguments or isolated examples. Marcus nodded, turning his laptop to show another document, a draft presentation titled Attribution Alignment, Maximizing Innovation Value at Meridian Technologies. We've been developing this for the past month, he explained. It correlates recognition practices with measurable outcomes: client retention, implementation success, talent retention, market penetration. The pattern is consistent across every metric we've analyzed. As I reviewed their work, a profound realization settled over me. Marcus and Elena hadn't just identified the same problem I had experienced. They had methodically documented its systemic nature and quantified its impact. What I had felt as personal frustration, they had translated into organizational analysis. This is remarkable work, I acknowledged, but approaching investors directly carries significant professional risk for all of us. Richard wouldn't view this as constructive feedback. He'd see it as undermining his leadership. Elena's expression remained calm, her response measured. We understand the risk. We've accepted it as the necessary cost of creating meaningful change. The question is whether you're willing to join us in taking that risk. Her direct question cut through assumptions and abstractions, forcing me to confront the fundamental choice before me. Continue working within a system that systematically obscured contributions, or risk my position to help transform that system into something more aligned with both individual recognition and organizational effectiveness. The decision point had arrived more quickly than I had anticipated, presented not as a gradual evolution, but as a clear fork in the road. My response would determine not just my own professional trajectory, but potentially Meridian's structural future. Before I answer, I said carefully, I need to understand exactly what you're proposing, not just the general approach, but the specific steps and potential outcomes, including worst-case scenarios. Marcus and Elena exchanged glances, seemingly reassured by my methodical response. Over the next hour, they outlined their proposed approach in detail, compiling the attribution analysis into a comprehensive presentation, arranging a private meeting with Meridian's primary investors, demonstrating how the current structure limited company valuation, and proposing a specific reorganization that would better align contribution with recognition while maintaining Meridian's market position. The ideal outcome, Elena explained, isn't removing Richard, but redefining his role to leverage his actual strengths, business development, initial client relationships, strategic partnerships, while allowing technical leaders to receive appropriate attribution and client access. And the worst-case scenario? I pressed. Richard views it as an insurmountable breach of trust, Marcus acknowledged. We lose our positions at Meridian, potentially face legal challenges regarding confidentiality, though we've been careful to use only aggregated data that doesn't disclose client-specific information. I nodded, appreciating their candor about the risks involved. And you've both decided this is worth pursuing despite those risks? We have, Elena confirmed. For me, it's ultimately a rational calculation. Meridian's current trajectory under the existing attribution model limits both organizational potential and individual career development. The potential upside of structural change outweighs the risks of maintaining the status quo. Marcus's motivation seemed more personal. I've watched too many brilliant colleagues leave because their contributions weren't properly recognized. Each departure diminishes Meridian's innovative capacity. It's unsustainable, not just personally frustrating, but institutionally self-defeating. Their commitment was evident, their analysis sound, their proposed approach methodical rather than reactionary. Yet the magnitude of what they were suggesting, essentially a structural challenge to Richard's leadership model, required careful consideration. I need 24 hours, I told them. Not because I disagree with your analysis, but because joining this effort would represent a significant escalation beyond my current concerns about the Delancey situation. I want to be certain I'm making this decision with full awareness of its implications. They both nodded, respecting my need for deliberation. As we prepared to leave, Elena offered one final observation that would resonate throughout my consideration. Sophia, regardless of your decision, remember this. Systems don't change because individuals accommodate them. They change because individuals challenge them, often at personal risk. The question isn't whether challenging the current structure might cost you something. It almost certainly will. The question is whether continuing within that structure hasn't already been costing you something more valuable than job security. Her words followed me home that evening, echoing as I considered not just the immediate Delancey situation, but the broader pattern it represented. The next morning, Richard called me into his office to discuss Delancey's conditions for moving forward. His expression was carefully neutral as I entered. I've been thinking about Delancey's request, he began. While I still believe our standard client relationship model serves Meridian best overall, I recognize the value of securing this particular contract. He slid a document across his desk, a proposed exception protocol that would allow me to lead the Delancey implementation team directly while maintaining Richard as the primary client contact for all other aspects of the relationship. This addresses their technical implementation concerns while preserving our broader relationship structure, he explained. A reasonable compromise, don't you think? The document represented exactly what Marcus and Elena had predicted, an individual accommodation rather than systemic change. It created a narrowly defined exception for one specific client, while reinforcing the overall structure that systematically misaligned contribution and recognition throughout Meridian. 5 days earlier, I might have accepted this compromise, gratefully seeing it as a personal victory and professional advancement. Now, with the broader pattern clearly documented and its organizational impact quantified, I recognized it for what it was: a tactical concession designed to preserve a problematic system. "Richard," I said carefully, "I appreciate the flexibility regarding Delancey, but I think this highlights a more fundamental question about how Meridian recognizes and leverages technical expertise across all our client relationships." His expression tightened slightly. "We've discussed this, Sophia. Meridian's client relationship model has built our reputation and secured our market position. One client's preferences don't justify overhauling our entire approach." "What if Delancey isn't an outlier but an indicator?" I suggested. "What if their insistence on direct access to technical leadership reflects a broader market evolution in how security expertise is valued and engaged?" Richard studied me with new awareness, perhaps sensing that my perspective had expanded beyond my individual situation. "You've been talking to others about this," he observed, not quite a question. I met his gaze directly. "Yes, and documenting patterns in how attribution affects measurable outcomes at Meridian. The data suggests our current model may be limiting rather than optimizing our potential." In that moment, as Richard's expression shifted from mild concern to pointed wariness, I recognized that a threshold had been crossed. By acknowledging the broader analysis and systemic perspective, I had effectively aligned myself with the structural challenge Marcus and Elena were proposing. The turning point had arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet clarity. The path forward would require fundamental change rather than incremental accommodation. My decision was made not in that 24-hour reflection period, but in the moment I recognized Richard's exception protocol for what it truly was: a mechanism for preserving a system that needed transformation, not modification. "I think we need to have a more comprehensive conversation about Meridian's organizational structure," I said finally. "Not just regarding Delancey, but about how we align contribution and recognition across all our work." Richard's response was measured but unmistakably cautious. "That's a much broader discussion than addressing Delancey's specific requirements. Let's focus on securing this contract first, then consider whether broader adjustments might be warranted." I nodded agreement, recognizing that the immediate client need provided a legitimate reason to postpone the larger confrontation. But as I left Richard's office with the exception protocol in hand, my path was clear. That evening, I would call Marcus and Elena to confirm my participation in their effort. The structural challenge would proceed. The turning point wasn't choosing conflict over accommodation. It was recognizing that true resolution required addressing causes rather than symptoms, systems rather than instances. It was the moment when individual frustration transformed into organizational vision, when pursuing change became not just about personal recognition, but about creating a structure where everyone's contributions could be properly valued and leveraged. It was this clarity that would ultimately lead to my name appearing on Meridian's letterhead, not as the conclusion of a personal journey, but as the visible manifestation of a necessary structural realignment that would ultimately strengthen the organization that both Richard and I, in our different ways, had helped build. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.